RRVAN was started in 2006 by a group of families and one provider, Barb Stanton, and adults on the spectrum, and has really grown in 10 years. And we're really ready to take more steps forward because we've got a lot of activities going on and we're expanding them right now. The format today is a brief overview of the topic, followed by a question and answer session. We'll try to repeat questions so that everyone can hear in case you don't catch it. We're also going to ask you to fill out the feedback form, which, again, we really do use those. We're privileged today to have on our a panel one of our adults with Asperger's and a professional in the community. So I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is John Cody. I have Asperger's syndrome. I'm able to give you that perspective of the topic today. I'll be able to answer any questions that you have. I'm a professional public speaker that speaks on this topic regularly, and it is my passion and my mission to help people understand and know more about Asperger's and try to advocate for people with Asperger's.
I'm Bridget Hinds. I'm a transition facilitator with the Transition Independence Program at Southeast Student Center. I work with transition age youth 14 to 20 children.
Thank you. We're glad both of you are with us. Our speaker today, our presenter today is Margie Gray. She's the business manager, is that correct? And trainer with Specialist
Employment Services.
Employment Services. I'm sorry, I
That's
never
okay.
get it right.
Okay.
Margie Gray is the Employment Services Manager with Specialist Midwest. I will let her tell you a little bit more about that. Margie's knowledgeable about child and adolescent development. She knows of the strengths of those on the spectrum, as well as lagging skills that they need support in developing. She also has a unique view of how those lagging skills impact an individual's readiness for the workplace. So we're pleased to have you, Margie, as our presenter. Thank you.
Thanks. So, as Joanne said, I work for Specialist Midwest. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are an organization that recruits, assesses, trains, and employs adults on the autism spectrum. So we are not a service agency, we are an employer. Individuals that come to us, the only requirements are that they self-identify as being on the autism spectrum. They have to be 18 years of age or older, and they have to have either a high school diploma or the equivalent. So we work with organizations in the area to identify jobs that the organization needs to fill, and then we recruit folks who can fill those positions. And the individuals that we recruit become our employees once they start to work for the employer. We continue to serve as sort of a buffer. We educate the employer as to how to be effective in working with the individuals that go into their organization, as well as work with the individuals in supporting them in being successful in the workplace. So my perspective is maybe a little bit unique in that I see a lot of things with the folks that we assess and train that are obstacles for them to overcome in the workplace. And so when we start talking about transition, the other side, the flip side of my perspective is that I have a 12-year-old son who's on the spectrum. So I meet a lot of parents, and I see myself in them, and I see things that I'm like, ooh, you know, if they knew this, it might be helpful in supporting their adult child in being successful. So when Joanne and I started talking about this, it's a subject I'm passionate about, and so I'm really excited that I get to be here and share my experiences with you. So just understand that as we go through this, my perspective is focused on long-term outcomes. So the ability to be successful in the workplace. So a lot of what we talk about is skill building. And when I say we, I'm talking all of us who are caregivers for individuals who are overcoming the obstacles of being on the spectrum. So, you know, there's sort of two sides to every story, right? So, you know, we have to be very deliberate in teaching a lot of skills that come naturally to neurotypical individuals. But in addition to being very deliberate, you know, sometimes we just get lucky, and we'll figure out that we have actually been working on something that was really useful for our son, and honestly, we didn't really understand what the long-term benefit of working on that was, but it you know, sometimes we get lucky. The idea that you can't start too early. We did a transition discussion once before, and a lot of the parents of our younger kids didn't come to that one because they didn't really feel like, I'm guessing, because they didn't feel like it really applied to them. I'm here to tell you, preaching to the choir, I can see heads nodding, you cannot start too early. That being said, start where you are. You know, don't beat yourself up if you hear of people who are starting with 4-year-old kids who have been diagnosed and your child is in junior high or high school or beyond. And a lot of these things are not things you've thought about before. And you know, the third thing is, it can be really overwhelming. Honestly, I'm in one of those phases right now. You know, we all have those moments where it's like, did I do enough? Am I doing the right thing? Is this really serving him in the long run, right? But the thing to remember is all you can do is all you can do. And as long as you're doing the best you can, you're doing the best for your child. So the things that these are sort of topics that we're going to go over today. I'll tell you right now, there's a typo, but taking it all in is, we're not going to cover that today. That'll be a topic for next month. It'll be part of next month. It just got to be too much. So talking about problem solving, self-awareness, the many me's, this is something that was really interesting to me as I started working with the adults on the spectrum. Accommodation, perspective taking, and then self-advocating. So problem solving. And I sort of broke this into the goals of each of the topics as well as what are some of the strategies that we can use. And that's, please understand, number one, every individual is unique. And nothing is going to work for every person, and everything is not going to work for every person. I don't know if that came out right. But knowing that it's important to pick and choose what works for you, your situation, and that you use the things that are helpful, and just disregard the rest. So looking at problem solving. So, you know, the ultimate goals with problem solving are, you know, this first one, avoiding learned helplessness. So I had an individual who was sitting at a table working in our office one day, and he looked up and he said, "I need tape." And there was silence in the room. He was obviously expecting someone else to solve that problem for him. And I work with, you know, some really talented people, and the other person that was in the room at the time, and my office is right next to the training room, so I get to just listen and take it all in at times. The other person said, what might you do if you need tape? And there was more silence. So this just sort of went on for a while. So one of the things that it's really easy to want to make life good for our kids and to make it easier for them, because there are so many things that make it hard for them. in the big picture though, we have to keep in mind that we can cross this line that takes us into an area that really doesn't serve them long term. And at some point, we have to start looking at avoiding that. I ran into this the other day with my son. He's standing in the middle of the living room and I'm sitting on the sofa and he says, "Where's my iPod?" I said, "I don't know." And he started to get really amped up. And I said, "Wait, take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. So where have you looked?" He hadn't. And so we started talking through it. And I said, "So, have you checked on the kitchen counter yet?" And just sort of stepped him through the process. So it's something that comes up from the time our kids are very young. Teaching them those skills to be good problem solvers serves many purposes and will take them all the way through their lives. So it's important for all of us to make mistakes at a manageable level. And if I keep my son from making mistakes because I fix everything before it gets broken, he will never learn how to deal with the frustration of having made a mistake and having to deal with the consequences. We want to do it in manageable terms, but it's important, that's another lesson that's important to learn in the scope of problem solving. Asking appropriate questions. So, when individuals ask questions, there's this spectrum that I have experienced in our office. And it goes from, I have one individual who never asks questions, or let me rephrase, never used to ask questions. And we had to work a lot on when is it appropriate to ask questions, because you're not asking questions and you're just continuing down this path, and guess what? The path you've been working on for the last 2 hours, we got to go back and redo all that. So there's that end that I don't ask questions at all because I'm afraid of, you treating me like I'm dumb, or that whatever reason it is that the individual, our life experience takes us to where we are right now. There's a reason he doesn't like to ask questions. It's important for us as caregivers to teach that it's okay to ask questions. The other end of that spectrum is someone who every question that comes into their mind comes out their mouth. And so I had a talk with that individual one day and I said, 9 times out of 10, I'll hear you verbalize a question and then you solve it yourself. When you verbalize the question, the people around you feel like you're asking for input. And if you are able to take the questions that you can solve on your own and not verbalize them, it increases their perception of your competency level. And so having that, really working on, problem solving helps with that, with determining when is it appropriate to ask questions and when not. It also supports frustration management, because if I can solve my own problems, I'm not nearly as frustrated. Certainly builds, I don't think I need to talk about, builds confidence and competency. And it increases their level of independence and capacity for work. So how do we do that? Well, I think every single slide for methods starts with age appropriate, because this is all stuff that we can start when our kids are very young. We start to build these foundational skills. So providing acceptable options is like that starting point. I remember the first time that my son gave me acceptable options. He said, "Mom, what are we having for dinner?" And I said, "Oh, I baked chicken." And he said, "So Mom, are you going to take me to McDonald's or Burger King for dinner tonight?" And I said, "Wow, that was impressive. You really learned," because I did that to him all the time, right? Did it to him. I was supporting him in learning how to make those choices. So providing acceptable options is sort of the starting point. Model problem solving. So being very conscious and deliberate about problem solving things, little things around the house. verbalizing and walking them through the process, verbalizing thought processes. So those all sort of tie together. If I'm problem solving, and I know I learned, Barb Stanton was the one that first really clarified this for me, was, you know, verbalizing my thought processes helps him to understand what kind of thought processes he could be going through. So it helps to go through those, how do I problem solve things? I look at the options. So what are my options right now for handling this situation? Well, I could do this, or I could do this, or I could do this. And if I do this, these are the things that are going to happen. And really talking through those things can actually help to start the development of those types of processes for them. And then anybody who's ever heard me speak, I don't know that I've ever spoken and didn't bring up Ross Green's work. Seriously, I think he's amazing. I think that collaborative and proactive solutions is a phenomenal way to teach problem solving and skill and build that skill in a really tangible way. Self-awareness. So, you know, the goals with increasing the level of self-awareness, so being able to identify when anxiety or stress are starting to increase for an individual. And I have folks who work for me who are not conscious of that at all. It requires somebody telling them, it really seems like you're stressed out. What's going on? Or what's going on for you? You just don't seem to be yourself right now. So the more self-awareness they can develop along the way, the better off they're going to be long term. Identification of the stressors that have an impact on them. It would be great to be able to identify what is the state of my physical well-being. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So, well, I'll do it now. So the physical well-being, am I sick or am I just having an off day? I just don't feel great, right? Being able to build the stamina to push through off days. So the off days can be really big for our kids on the spectrum. Because if they're either off or they're on. One of the two, no in between, in many cases. Being able to build the stamina to push through an off day is huge. And it's something that we're working on in our house right now. You know? And so but I see it with the adults who work for us, the struggle of, well, am I sick or am I, and I'll get calls where I'm like, where the conversation is like, okay, well, I just don't feel very good, but I'm not coughing and I don't have a fever. What do I do? So those types of self-awareness, both emotional and physical self-awareness, are really important. The ability to gauge an appropriate response to the physical and emotional states. So, am I going to stay home from school or work today, or am I going? Am I able to, and all of these topics are so woven together that it's difficult to pull them apart completely. So being able to advocate for myself when I know that I'm in this state, that would be an appropriate response to a diminished emotional state. Building that self-advocacy, the awareness is what builds the ability to self-advocate. If you don't have that self-awareness, it's hard to advocate for yourself. So what are the methods? Obviously, age-appropriate, starting with talking during non-escalated times. Play detective. I used to do this with my son. We played Sherlock Holmes all the time. And we would talk about things and say, okay, well, what happened just before that happened? And have him reflect back on what was going on for him. What was going on? What was he thinking? What did his body feel like? Those type of things will have helped him to have a higher level of self-awareness. Asking prompting questions. So Joanne's great at this. So it seems to me like Maybe you're feeling a little stressed right now. I've heard you talk about Colin and the conversations that you have. So asking those prompting questions to help put words to things that they may not have words for. Giving plenty of time and space for reflection. So if I ask a question and I don't get a response right away, I just wait. And I may ask the question again in a couple minutes to see if there's been processing going on or if he's been thinking about something else. But giving plenty of time and finding those places where you have your really informative conversations. There were 3 times that I can think of off the top of my head that were always good for me to get information. If we were in the car and my back was to him and he was sitting in the back seat, generally speaking, I would get way more information than if we were having a face-to-face conversation. If he was in the bathtub when he was younger and he was relaxed, you know, he's like in that warm water and I didn't sit like this with him. I'm off doing my own thing, you know, cleaning things up, whatever. And I'd just ask a question and he'd have time to process an answer. So finding those kind of opportunities to really get the information and help them to identify the information for themselves, it's a huge benefit for them in the long term. If you don't get an answer right away, really scheduling time to get back to it can be a good strategy, especially with older kids, like teenagers, who let them put it on their schedule. Let them identify the time. Give them some control in the situation. And then, you know, using real life or movie examples. So real life examples are great if it's something that happened to them. So if my son was, so self-awareness. So when he was in kindergarten, when he stood in line, he would always kick the back of the shoe of the person in front of him. No matter how many times the teacher talked to him about it, it was just this thing that he did. One day, he was in line, and the kid behind him started kicking the back of his shoe. And he just about came unglued, right? The teacher, oh my God, it was a beautiful moment. She said, "Chandler, how did that feel? It seems like that was really upsetting and frustrating to you." "Yes, it was." So do you think that maybe the other students that you do that to feel the same way? It was like a huge light bulb went on. So anytime there's a real life experience where that example can be reflected back to them, it has more meaning. It's not something that I'm expected to understand conceptually. It's something that's concrete that I've experienced. And then movies, I like movies for examples. I mean, if I can talk about, well, so why do you think Han Solo was so worried about seeing Princess Leia again? And using those as a starter for conversation, that can be incredibly helpful. Okay, the many me's. This is something that was an aha moment for me. Sitting with someone and talking about appropriate behavior in the workplace. So, I mean, this applies to everything. Appropriate behavior at school, in church, in the grocery store, whatever. There are many me's, and that was how I described it to this individual. I said, you know what? I am one person when I'm at home, and I'm a little bit different when I'm at work. And I'm a little bit different yet when I'm at the hockey rink watching hockey. Okay, maybe I'm a lot different there, okay? So, but I described all these different roles that I play in my life. I'm different when I'm with family than when I'm with friends. They're all me. I don't feel like I'm not being me just because I'm a little bit different. And to really start to build that sense of, I can be different in different contexts, and it is not being inauthentic. Because that's what it boiled down to. But that's not who I am. You're censoring me, was the comment that I got. I said, you know, certain types of humor are not appropriate here. but you're censoring me. No, I'm asking you to be appropriate for this particular context. So managing the goals, obviously being appropriate in a variety of environments, reducing the feeling of being inauthentic, and managing frustration surrounding contextual appropriateness, because what's more frustrating than going into a situation and saying something and everybody stopping and looking at you? That's really uncomfortable. So managing the frustration surrounding those situations is definitely a benefit. So obviously we want to start with the age-appropriate level. And talking about the fact that we're different in different contexts. Modeling situations. So, you know, if we go from one situation to another and then afterwards say, so did you notice that, I don't know, when I was in church, I talked much quieter than I do when I'm yelling for you and your brother. It's because that's what's appropriate in church. So talking about those, modeling the situations, talking about how to identify acceptable behavior, how to identify what is appropriate. That's a great conversation to have. And then using, you know, for younger kids, using social stories and role playing. And also, I think movies are great for like really illustrating things, especially if it's something that's a particular interest. So accommodation, our 4 pillars are clarity, respect, accommodation, and accessibility, sorry. So accommodation is a big deal for us because we accommodate the disability that the individual is coming to us with. It's been a big learning experience to support the understanding that accommodation is not a one-way street. Accommodation comes from both sides. We have to somehow meet in the middle. And we're not always going to meet right in the middle. You know, it's like I may have to come way over here toward you on some things, but there are other things where I'm going to need you to come a little bit closer to me. And we're going to work on those and figure out what are the things where it is closer for you to come, where it's possible, where it's easier for you to get to this end than on others. We need to identify what are the things that, where is it on that range that we're going to meet on each thing that comes up. So when we talk about accommodation, it's an understanding that it's a two-way street. That actually supports the implementation of the many me's, because if I say, okay, I understand that generally speaking, you have a very dark sense of humor, a very dark, sarcastic sense of humor. I understand that. I need you to come way more in my direction on that one, because there are certain things we cannot talk about. Somebody should die in the workplace. We can't imply that. And I get that it's part of a dark sense of humor. That's a deal breaker, all right? So I need you to be able to come toward me. And I'm not censoring you. I'm asking you to put on a different hat. I'm asking you to use the parts of who you are that are appropriate in this context and leave the parts that are not appropriate for this context at home or with your friends. That's all I'm asking. It increases flexibility, and it definitely gives them the ability to manage the workplace. So obviously, once again, it's got to be age appropriate. Coming up with what are the acceptable options. Providing, one of the pieces of feedback that I got at one point from one of our folks was, you spend a lot more time telling me what I can't do than what I can do. And I was like, wow. That hit me right between the eyes, and I was like, you're right. I'm good at saying you can't tell really dark, sarcastic jokes. What can you do instead? So we're really focused on, I refocused on making sure that I'm providing acceptable options. I want to model accommodation. I want to point it out because sometimes it's not recognized as being an accommodation. It's like, well, I'm accommodating you. What are you doing for me? Well, that's a fair question. So these are the things that we've done to accommodate. You have a schedule that is a shorter day than a typical work day. You start later in the day than most of the other people. When you have a bad day and something happens that somebody could be fired for, you weren't fired because we were able to work through that with your employer. So all of the, and I'm talking from the work perspective, but all of this applies to school-age kids as well. It all translates right into that same type of providing acceptable options. Walking through the process, so I think I've talked about all this. Verbalizing the thought process, and then Ross agrees. I think this one may be like a duplicate slide to one that I had earlier because it's really the same strategies. Perspective taking. So what are the potential outcomes of taking another person's perspective? I might have better hygiene because I might recognize the fact that when I stink, it affects the people around me. I'm sorry, I had this conversation with my son this morning, that's why it's a little bit intense. Okay? He plays hockey, hello. Ultimately, they're going to have a better understanding and a better recognition of unwritten rules, whether those are social, appropriate attire, appropriate language. There are a lot of benefits in terms, and think about it, there are so many unwritten rules. Those are just a few examples, right? They're going to come up with more appropriate, I say work behavior, but think about it. More appropriate social behavior, more appropriate behavior in the classroom, more appropriate because they're going to be able to recognize that what's going on for them affects the people around them. And it's going to reduce their frustration and anxiety because they're not going to be so stressed out about the fact that they're so different that they're creating these moments where they become the focus of attention when they didn't want to be. So those are the goals of being able to have good perspective taking. How do you do it? It's got to be age appropriate, modeling it. I have a couple of guys that at the end of the day, they just vanish into thin air. And I'm like, can you just put your head in my office and let me know you're going? I mean, the looks that I got, you would have thought that I'd asked them to cut off their right arm or something. And we ended up having a conversation around it, and it was it was shocking to me. I was told, it just never occurred to me that anything that I'm doing would have an impact on anybody else. And I was like, wow. Well, let's talk about that. And we talked about, well, why would I want to know when you're leaving at the end of the day? Well, maybe there's something that I need to talk to you about before tomorrow, and I don't want to interrupt what you're doing right now, or I'm busy right now, but I need to talk to you before you leave today. So if I know you're leaving, then I can say, oh, and by the way, tomorrow, I need you to, I don't know, if it's possible for you, can you be in 15 minutes earlier for a meeting? Because I want you to meet with a client. So being able to have those conversations, talking through how one person impacts another. You know, these are the things that can happen in our everyday conversations, just as things come up when we see that we're having an impact on other people. Did you see how that person just cut me off? It made me have to slam my brakes on. Did you hear how rude that person was to me? You know, I can let that affect me, or, you know, but I have to understand that, man, when that person just said something really mean to me, it hurt my feelings. So if you say something really mean to someone, it may hurt their feelings. Externalizing our thoughts, we talked about that already, and then using life experience to ask how another impacted them. So the shoe thing, I think is, with my son in kindergarten, is a great example of how being able to understand that perspective taking. And then just know that this is only the beginning of a very long road. And this is what we talked, the topics that I covered are, I won't say they're the tip of the iceberg, but unless things have changed, we're planning on doing this again next month, focusing on transition. There were at least 2 topics that I had to cut out of this because I already went way too long. So using this as a springboard, and the idea is what questions, comments do you have in reference to taking the opportunities from the very beginning to start to teach these skills so that folks can be more effective? John, would you like to, do you have something you want to contribute right away that struck you?
I do agree with a lot of what you said. I do think, like, a lot of the stuff you're talking about with learning these things and modeling are things that you do pick up from trial and error. That was at least the case for me. Understanding how things affect other people, that's stuff that I learned in middle school, elementary school. Nothing really coming to my mind right now, but just that I do agree with a lot of what you said. Oh, and yes, you were also talking about that you have an on day or an off day. That really did strike me as, yes, that pretty much is the case. Okay. And when you're talking about verbalizing questions, when you're having an off day, when you're really having a lot of stress or a lot of anxiety, you basically come to a point where you are at a verbal paralysis, where it's really hard to ask a question. And that could be something why a certain employee might not be verbalizing their questions. They're too stressed to even verbalize it. But I just wanted to add that. But
no, that's a great point. Bridget, is there anything that struck you? You work with a lot of the folk. We work with some of the same people. So
a lot of the modeling. I do a lot of role playing with the youth that I work with. A lot of what I do is accessing resources, so showing them how to access it, and it's a few times, and then allowing them to try it while I'm with them, supporting them, allowing them to make their own decisions, do a lot of motivational interviewing, asking lots of questions to see what do they know, and then helping them think through the problem solving. And so a lot of what Margie talked about is I do a lot with the individuals that I work with.
So what things come up for you that are either questions or additional or experience? Yeah.
So when my son's 10, and we were dealing with the concept of the mini-me's, and we were trying to explain to him how he is still the same person, but a different characteristic show. And so we tried to use the concept of someone in costume to show him, and he couldn't get beyond the costumes. And so I changed it, and I put pictures of our house up. So I put a picture of the outside of our house, and I said, "What is this?" He said, "That's our house." And then I put a picture of his bedroom up, and I said, "What is this?" And he said, "That's my bedroom." And I put a picture of the bathroom up. "What is this?" "That's our bathroom." And I said, "Okay, that's the bathroom, that's not our house." And he's like, "No, it's a part of our house." And I said, "Yes, but somebody looking at it may not be able to identify it as part of our house because you're only seeing part of it right now." "Well, yes." "Okay, but what if you are in the bathroom? Is that the same thing you do in your bedroom?" "Mom, no, that's ridiculous. I don't do poop in my bedroom." Right? And so it was just helpful for him anyways to use to like depersonalize it and use the house analogy versus people in costumes. So that we really got a long ways with that for some reason.
No, that's a great strategy. And having, concrete discussing concepts is really not necessarily the most effective way to go with most of the folks that I know. But having those concrete examples using the house, I mean, that's, Courtney and I work together, so it's going to really kill me to say this. That was genius! Don't want you to get a big head, but no, that was genius.
What struck me was the whole concept of talking about the many me's. I hadn't thought of it in that way before, because we've had pushback too. My grandson is 16. Sometimes it's hard to tell how much of what's going on is because he's a teenager and how much is because he has Asperger's. I always default to Asperger's first and treat it as though it's the Asperger's, and then I can find out pretty fast if it's not. But it was the same kind of thing, but that isn't me. Why do I have to pretend? And so this concept really is going to help me talk about it with him, because you're not pretending when you're acting appropriate in this situation versus this one. We talk so much about helping our kids learn to generalize. And so this is kind of an opposite concept to that, except we want them to take the skills they've learned and apply them here, and then apply them a little bit differently here, which is hard.
It is. It is. I think that, honestly, I think that that speaks to black and white thinking. I think that, you know, when you're working on reducing the level of black and white thinking or rigid thinking, that you're probably supporting the development of being able to embrace that I can be one way in one place and a different way in another place. Yeah.
My name's Mark. I was at that very first RRVAN meeting.
Oh, wow.
Yes, you were one of our founding members.
Our son is 18, he's a freshman in college, and modeling is probably some of the biggest thing we use. I still spend now I spend every weekend at the university and help him through things. He does okay during the week when he can follow the schedule. It's when things that are unexpected are thrown in there and we have some challenges. But every weekend I go there and I do the housekeeping, all that stuff. But my question is, you know, as it's going through school, you have so much control over, as a parent, of what's going on, and then when you hit this magical age of 18, it stops. And you no longer have access to pretty much anything. So I don't know how to help so much anymore, because we're not in the loop. So that's where I struggle, is how much help should I be giving, and am I giving too much? And so, yeah.
You know, that's like the $64,000 question, because, you know, I said at the very beginning that I interact with a lot of parents of adults on the spectrum. And, you know, I have moments where I see dynamics going on, and I don't judge because I don't know the history and I don't know what paths have already been taken. But for me, as the parent of a 12-year-old, I file it away and I'm like, you know what? My son, I do that. And my son will not develop this skill to become independent if I continue doing that. You know, at some point, I mean, he's 12. At some point, he needs to be able to schedule appointments, use the tools that he has, like his calendar and his alarms and all of that, the reminders, to keep up with appointments. And if I continue to do that, and he's in a transition stage himself because he is in middle school now, and there's this whole new level of independence and proactive, I guess, stuff that they're supposed to start doing in middle school. And this is, it's been tough for me. I feel that, how do I do this in a way that supports him in developing, that doesn't allow him to fall into the abyss without a net? What's the balance?
I think it's really important for us to remember that we do give our kids typically more support than another person that same age, because developmentally they are behind in having gained those skills. So what you're talking about in terms of being very thoughtful and have a reason behind why you do things. The example you gave, Mark, to some people who don't know kids with autism would go, you mean you go every weekend? And, but yes, because if I don't do that, that's going to send him in a downward spiral, and then he's not going to be able to handle what he can handle when he's got that support. And so in other words, and we've talked in the past about step by step where they are and help them build the skills to go forward. So it is tricky, but I think we need to be sure that we're not second guessing ourselves all the time if we keep in mind that actually, he's making strides, although it's slower than I might see in my other child.
And I just want to, and then I want to grab you. The thing that I want to say is kudos to all of you, because there is, I don't know about for you, but for me, there is so much more thought, planning. I know that all parents have anxiety, but I feel like our kids are the canaries in the mine shaft. They identify the problems in the world. We are the ones who are caring for the canaries, right? And to keep them from going over the cliff it's a job. It is intense parenting. Mm-hmm. And so, seriously, to all of you.
I was going to kind of build on what Joanne was talking about, in that we all have these goals in mind as parents, and I see it in our support staff for my son. I mean, when you have staff that work with your family so regularly, they become part of your family. Mm-hmm. And what I would caution is when we look at age appropriate, that is such a fragile term, because we might be saying, and I've worked with families too that do this, well, that's age appropriate, that's okay for them. Or they're trying to work on age appropriate skill set, but by the time they achieve that skill set, they're behind. And so we need to know our children and know what the goals should be, but then I think it's also important so that we don't teach, one, that we don't enable, and two, that we don't teach them that learned helplessness. Here, I'll do it for you.
Because sometimes it's just easier.
It is. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I would caution, don't get so hung up on the age appropriate, but look at what skills can you learn now to get to adult skills that they will need down the road.
And I love that piece of feedback. In fact, I'm going to change that term, because it should be individual, individual appropriate. Individually appropriate. I'm not sure what the term is yet, but I absolutely get what you're saying, and honestly that's what I was intending, but it's not what that term says. Mm-hmm. So we have to think about that one. What is the right term? Because it needs to be appropriate for the individual that you're working with.
It's so easy. I know we do that all the time. We look at IEP goals. Well, this isn't grade appropriate. We look at personal goals. Well, this isn't age appropriate. But, one day they're going to have to learn laundry. Today we're going to work on just sorting colors. Mm-hmm. And then after that we'll look at folding. And, eventually we'll get to you do it yourself. But for today, what can we do? And it might not be age appropriate. It might not be what all these friends are doing, but that's what we're going to do.
Thank you. Seriously. Yes?
The way I kind of view it is developmentally appropriate. I'm going to take on a very, very brief description. I used to work with Alzheimer's patients quite a bit. I was a behavior management specialist. And with the arc of dementia, people lose developmental capabilities. And I would go out to these nursing facilities and talk to them about what would you expect a 5-year-old to be able to do? Well, they can maybe put clothes on, but they're not going to match. They can't cook for themselves. They may have the occasional accident. Okay, this person in their development, in their Alzheimer's disease, is now functioning at a level of a 5-year-old. Why are we expecting them to dress appropriately? Why are we expecting them on their own, and then we get angry at them for not doing it?
Yep.
So I kind of think that same way with my son, even my daughter to some extent, who just turned 14. Woo. So it's a lot of fun. I view, and my son was diagnosed with autism at a very young age, and he's been doing phenomenal things, and he's great at grade level, but he is not at age level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I have an idea where he's at developmentally, and things that he can do, and I try not to enable him with a lot of things. I can't find this. Well, how do we go about finding it? Where do we look? We don't stand in a room, open our eyes and say, I can't find it. We move things. We go around different things. So to push him to get to that, my daughter was also diagnosed with Asperger's, and they're twins. They're boy and girl, about as different as you can get. Stubborn as all get out. Our conversation for the last 3 weeks, Dad, will you shovel up half in the backyard so I can walk out to the bus without getting my socks wet? So our discussion has been, how can we avoid your socks getting wet? I don't know, what should I do? Well, let's talk about it. Maybe we can start by not wearing tennis shoes in the foot-deep snow. You can wear boots. That's one. Maybe we can, I don't know, pick up a shovel and shovel it yourself, because you're an able-bodied 14-year-old now who can do that. And I'm trying to get her involved in that. So her developmental age is much higher than my son's, and so it's teasing that out.
Yeah, that's great. That really clarifies it, and it's on point with what I intended. So yeah.
That must be very difficult though, because every child, an adult on the spectrum, are unique. You know, they have separate splinter skills, and they're so good at some things, and so have so many deficits in another thing. And you can't treat them the same. You know, it's got to be a challenge to have two kids the same age. And
you can't treat them the same, but you have to treat them the same?
Yeah.
Well, Benny gets away with this.
And
yes, he does.
And we
get away with this.
We talk a lot about the difference between equal and fair. No, it's not equal, but it is fair.
And sometimes it's not fair.
Okay.
Okay.
yeah, there you go.
You know, one thing that stuck out to me is I really like that term developmental level and age as well. And I think one thing that strikes me very clearly is when my grandson, who's 16, gets stressed out or starts developing toward what may become a meltdown, which he's very good at managing, much better now than he used to be. He's not 16 when he's stressed. And we deal with him at a much younger level, actually like a toddler sometimes, or a 5-year-old, because that's where he is in terms of his being able to process or manage what's going on. John, does that make sense to you? I mean, I don't mean to imply that he's being a baby or that he's, you know, immature. It just seems like he can't process at this level. He needs to process as a younger child might.
When you get to a certain stress level, I can see that, yes. Default would be, 16, but underneath enough stress and you're having trouble processing information, that doesn't make sense. That'd be a little bit of, you have to treat it as a little bit of a younger age, because it'd be more appropriate for that stress level. Under stress, it will affect your motor skills. It will affect your processing skills. It will affect how you can interact and how you can think. So I understand that, yes.
And just to add on to that, especially with my son, and then with some of the work I've done with some other people, in those stressful situations, you're going to revert to more of a, I need to survive.
Mm-hmm.
So the higher level thinking is not working.
Fight or
drop
flight.
down, drop down, drop down, to a point where I scream and I bang my head, and then I reset and everything's fine. So he would drop down very quickly. And we've got it to a point where there's no more head banging, there's no more self-injury, that has stopped. And he drops down, but quickly raised back up. So it's just recognizing that. But one of the biggest topics I talked about, and this goes with neurotypical kids, with kids on the spectrum, with people with Alzheimer's disease. Every behavior has a meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Everything they do, and the destructive behaviors are always caused by fear and frustration. And how do you deal with fear and frustration if you're not processing at that higher level? You drop down to a lower level to something that's worked. So to develop in my son the ability to recognize that you can drop down, but build up those higher levels so that he doesn't drop as far. And we've seen some success with that.
And to me, the problem-solving piece of it has made a huge difference in how far down
Yep.
and how quickly we drop.
And then also how quickly it goes
How
back up.
quickly, exactly. Yes.
So just a quick question then. I mean, yeah, every behavior has a meaning, but there also has to be a consequence for those behaviors sometimes too.
Exactly.
So, if we've been telling our son, okay, this is going to be the consequence if you skip one more class. This is going to be the consequence. And he knows this, and we, because he's having an off day or whatever, or there's something that triggered it, and we know there's always triggers. A lot of times we let it slide, but it's like you've got to get to the point where you've got to do the consequence. And then, so I have a question to that is, if there is a consequence, then do you adjust the maybe timing of how long that consequence is going to be played out based on maybe the trigger or what the meaning was of why he did what he did? Like, for example, skipping class, the consequence is his phone's going to be shut off. Well, instead of saying it's going to be shut off for a day, I want to talk through it with him. And then does that make sense? I mean, do you adjust that because now they're, instead of being at this low level, they can now be at this higher level? Or no, we want them back to the low level. That's when you talk about and identify their behavior, the consequence, and identify the goal to maybe regain that.
Yeah. Hey, Barb.
It's hard.
How fortuitous that you came in. Consequences is a really tricky conversation.
It's really tricky, and there is a point where you do need to keep your word. But I also think we don't want to ever punish for being autistic. So it's that, can we take it and turn it into a learning opportunity? And if there is going to be some consequence, I'm a big fan of how can you earn back time? How can you earn back that privilege? How can you do this? So it may be a very brief time, but there's an understanding that there are absolutes. So there's an absolute no. And if you cross that, here's what you can expect. But everybody makes mistakes. And let's not, and I know we've all been in that place where you say, you will never in the rest of your life play this video game ever again. So that's a great opportunity for us as adults to say, you know what, sometimes when I get upset and I get too high, I say things too that I don't mean. So let's go back. So it can serve multiple functions. It can be a learning opportunity. It can be an opportunity to, yep, people make mistakes. Let's get past that and earn the privilege back. But I think also there are times that you can say, you know what, I understand what was going on, let's talk through this. I don't think this is appropriate for you to have this consequence this time, but there may be times when it is appropriate, and we do need to follow through and hold the word to that.
Well, and I think too that the, continuing to work on why is he skipping class, and
Well,
continuing to work on the issues,
yeah.
let me rephrase. So continuing to work on that behavior and understanding what's underneath that behavior is part of, it's just part of the process. I'm struggling
And asking the questions correctly, because I don't get a response unless I ask the question correctly.
Exactly.
So-
Well,
Yeah.
Sometimes the natural consequence is the consequence. You missed that, so you didn't have time to work on that in class. So now you've got a little extra you have to do tonight. That works with my grandson. It's like, oh, I don't want to do homework.
Well,
so.
and that's happened because if he doesn't do what he does, then the teachers email me, and guess what? The game time is off, and he can have his game time when it's done with me at home, which he hates. He doesn't want the teachers to communicate with me at all.
Right.
Of course.
Sorry, John.
Yes.
There were like 3 hands, yes.
I was also thinking about what you were saying there, and I do think that there are times where consequences are appropriate, but I do think it needs to be scalable. So if you're trying to put a consequence towards an action that was caused by a panic attack, which is something that is not in your control, then you work on trying to fix whatever the trigger is to lessen that as a chance another time. If he's skipping class because he doesn't want to go to class, well then yes, it'd be a consequence, but it has to be something where it is an action that he has control over. Otherwise, what are we punishing? We're punishing involuntary actions, and you're not learning anything from it except for the fact that I'm being punished for being me, for my own personal deficits. So I do think it needs to be a scalable consequence there, but talk through it. Try to figure out what's going on, and like Joanne said, if you miss a class and you miss homework, you just do the homework at home because it has to get done, and that is a very appropriate consequence. And then, like what Barb was saying, if you need to do something, give them an option to earn it back as well. So there can be consequences. You can try to do an earn back system. You can do homework at home if you miss class. And then just talk through it. Talk through what was the trigger, what happened here, why did you skip class? Did you skip class because you were stressed? Did you skip class because you didn't want to go to class? Or did you skip class because there was something going on, like a panic attack or a meltdown or something that is out of their control? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And we kind of do that and problem solve, because when he has skipped class, rather than just shutting off his phone because he knows that's the consequence, I just wait till he gets home, and then I talk to him and I said, okay, well, if you went to that class and there was a different teacher, because that will throw him off. Or yesterday he skipped class and he said they changed classes. He didn't know where the room was. Okay, so he didn't get in trouble yesterday, but I said, if you don't know where the class is, if you go to the office, they would know where your class is. Or if you go to your other teacher, your IEP or they would know this. So you need to go ask. You cannot just go wherever you want to go. So we had this conversation yesterday, and then it happened 2 classes in a row today. So, it's like I feel like I have to enforce a consequence. But again, today he walked in, there was a sub. So I'm assuming that's probably what part of the problem was.
This was change
But
of
I don't
semester
know.
too, though, right?
Yep, just change the
See, and
semester.
that sometimes takes a really long time.
Yep.
Even though they may know the school, it's still different,
Well, but the first class he went into, he was talking to the principal, he had a pass, and he walked into the normal class, the normal teacher. He's got the same teachers as he did last time too, because we tried to do that. And she said, "Zach, where's your pass?" And he looked at her and walked out and never went back. So I don't know if he was embarrassed. You know, so I want to ask him those questions.
Right.
But it's like 2 days, I mean, this has been going on for a while. So, you know, you kind of keep saying, okay, well, you know. So I understand that there's triggers and trying to find out and give him resources and, you know, talking through it, giving examples, problem solving. But at some point, I think there has to be a consequence, and he has to be able to earn that back. Because if I keep saying, well, that's a habit, I don't think he ever believes that it will either.
Yeah,
Because he's actually told me, well, you've said that before, and you don't ever do it.
yeah,
Okay?
I understand more of that now, and yes, you've explained to him, you know, to go to the office to find out where the room is at. If that keeps on repeating, then some consequence, but then also an earn back system.
Yeah. Okay.
So unfortunately, we've run out of time.
The good news is, we have Part B of this discussion planned for next month. We knew this was a big topic. We knew that Margie had so much insight from day-to-day experiences with a wide range, from your son up to adults, that we planned intentionally to make this 2 parts. So we hope that you'll be able to come back for the next one.
And I promise I won't talk as much the next time.
No, it's
Sorry.
great.
Well, what you have to say is so interesting.
And
Barb,
please
did
make
you-
a sandwich if anybody wants some.
Right, if you didn't get one or would like us to help you, please help yourself.
I don't want to carry it back across the street, so please take it.
Thank you, Margie.
Thank you.